to the first day of level 2, and things to come. Greater freedom. Please don't abuse it. That's a message not to councillors who are very responsible, but to the wider public, I guess. This will be the last meeting that will be held in this style. I think next Thursday we'll be operating out of the reception lounge, and everybody will have got an email from Sandra just inviting you, whether you wanted to be in the reception lounge. I think we can have up to 10 councillors, including the Mayor, Sandra, I think, which means that we have another 11 that may wish to do it online. If you would all like to be there, then we'll do a rotation. But you've been invited just to indicate whether you're happy coming in or you're just as happy doing it online. Probably another 2 emergency committee meetings after this one to take us to the beginning of June, and then staff are working on a situation for us where we can gradually transition back to a more normal situation, I guess in July, starting with meetings of the committees of the whole, and we'll get a report hopefully by next week on the recommended transition back to council as normal. It may take a while to do that given the pressures on staff. So welcome today. Can I begin as my headmaster role requires me to do the roll call. So if we can start with Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Present, sir.
Thank you. Josephine Bartley.
Good morning.
Kathy Casey.
Morena, Phil.
Efeso Collins.
Talofa Mayor, talofa councillors.
Pippa Coombe.
Kia ora, Mr Mayor.
Linda Cooper.
Good morning.
Angela Dalton.
Present.
Chris Darby.
Morning, Mayor and members.
Alf Filipina.
Yo.
I think I heard that in the background. Chris Fletcher.
Present.
Shane Henderson.
Morning.
Richard Hills.
Kia ora koutou.
Tracy Mulholland.
Morena, present.
Daniel Newman.
Good morning, Your Worship.
Leanne Namane.
Kia ora, Mr Mayor.
Kia ora. Greg Sayers.
Present, Your Worship.
Leslie Simpson.
Good morning, everybody.
Sharon Stewart.
Good morning.
David Taipari.
Kia ora, Your Worship.
Kia ora. Wayne Walker. Wayne, have we got you there? We might not have Wayne, or if we do have him, he might have his mic off. We'll just get Sandra to check that out. John Watson.
Hello, Falava.
And Paul Young.
Good morning, Mr Mayor and everyone.
And I have a new device which hopefully has a much more reliable microphone than the one that I was trying to cope with yesterday. Big thank you, everybody, for your participation yesterday and for Desley and your cheering of that. It was some really challenging issues we've got there, but I think the discussion and the presentations were both constructive. I have no apologies at the moment, so we don't need to accept apologies. Declarations of interest. Are there any councillors with a potential conflict of interest they need to declare?
Your Worship, can I? It's not a declaration of interest, our fair. I just wanted to apologise with the yo when you asked. It's just that I was still eating breakfast and I would have spat out my food. So my humble apologies, and I am here.
Yeah, COVID-19 says not to spread anything from your mouth, let alone your breakfast, Alf, so that's fine. Great, no declarations of interest. Confirmation of minutes. I have one set of minutes from the 7th of May 2020. I move that we confirm the ordinary minutes of the 7th of May 2020 meeting as a true and correct record. Do I have a seconder for that, please?
Yes, you do.
Thank you. Been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. Carried. There are no petitions. There is no public input. There's no local board input. I have not been advised of any extraordinary items. So we come to the first substantive item, COVID-19 briefing and the Auckland Emergency Management status update. Let me just check. I think today we have Ian Maxwell, Mace Ward and Phil Wilson. Phil is in the room here. Mace and Ian, have we got you on the lines?
Yes, we are both together across another building.
Kate's an apology today.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So look, we're moving on, and level 2, and I get a morning update at 7:30 from the group controller, and what we're getting is a very clear trend in a decline in numbers for our 0800 number and a declining demand for our food packages. That can, I hope, be seen as a positive move. I think yesterday we were down to 152 calls and only 42 welfare requests, which means that people are now linked in with the Department of Social Development. They're better linked in with their families coming out of emergency level 4, and hopefully a sign that actually many more people are back at work and able to cope. Ian, maybe if I ask you to do an introduction, and then
Sure.
Mace and Phil, I think, will both want to contribute to the report today.
Yes. Look, thank you, Your Worship. I think what you've outlined is exactly clear. We are moving towards a recovery situation in just about all aspects that we'll talk about today. So look, I'll ask Mace just to run through what the response situation is, and then I'll talk a little bit about the council, where we're heading. We're obviously welcoming people back into work today as well, and then we'll get Phil to talk about the recovery. So Mace.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Your Worship and members, thank you very much. Just to, the nationwide state of national emergency was lifted yesterday, and we've now got a national transition period which came into force at midday yesterday, and this will remain in place for 90 days unless extended or terminated earlier. So we are now in level 2 and a shift from level 3, as you noted, Your Worship, over last evening, and taking us to a reduced phase in the recovery or response. I'll keep the update this morning brief, given that you've got quite a lot of other business on the agenda. The work volumes do remain high, but we are noticing a shift in that, and I'll talk about that. The Emergency Coordination Centre in Bledisloe House remains active with a team of people across emergency management and other council representatives and our other response agencies in the region contributing. Those that don't need to work from the office remain working at home. We are operating in tandem with other agencies, as I say, but separated from the Emergency Coordination Centre is the Regional Isolation and Quarantine Cell, which is, as you are all, I think, aware, a multi-agency cell responding to managing the needs of returning and departing travellers. There are a similar model operating in Christchurch to receiving returning travellers to hotels in that region as well. In terms of caring for our communities or welfare, the welfare response continues to be the predominant focused response on non-health related welfare needs of Aucklanders and people isolating in our region. We are working more closely with other support agencies, as noted by the Mayor, like food banks, community-led food banks, and MSD, Ministry of Social Development, on a more sustainable long-term solutions for community support. Our welfare food parcel initiative has now been running for 6 weeks, and we've received 33,700 calls to the 0800 number over that time, resulting in 17,221 calls for assistance. As noted, the requests over the last week have totalled for assistance 464. That compares to the first week in the response of where we're getting 5,000 calls for assistance early in the response, and that has continued to halve each week as we've progressed. But we have we've provided assistance to 15,500 households across Auckland over that time. Many Aucklanders are facing challenging circumstances, and our teams, along with our partners, particularly MSD, are coordinating support to connect callers with other services where possible, including other agencies, and particularly I'd acknowledge the community-led food banks and welfare support agencies. MSD are reporting, as we are finding in our welfare desk, more complex needs for those seeking assistance, including health needs, and that includes also migrant families. MSD have noted to us a significant number of new customers and new clients that it has established during this response period, reflecting the fact that the impact on lockdown has been indiscriminate and affected many people in our community. We hope to see that change, of course, now that we're in level 2. I just would also note that our welfare support is available to all residents in Tamaki, including migrants. Ministry of Social Development report this morning that they are also opening their welfare centres, so people will have direct access in a controlled way following hygiene standards. As I mentioned last week, we have submitted our first reimbursement claim to the National Emergency Management Agency for our welfare support. This just does not include staff time and other agencies, but that totals $4.5 million as at last week for the scale of our local response in Auckland to date. That will continue as we continue to support community-led response, and we see a shift, of course, to central government agencies. I'll just touch now on the Regional Isolation and Quarantine Coordination Group. As of the 12th of May, there were 2,209 people as guests in our managed isolation hotels and 104 people in quarantine hotels in Auckland. And this total continues to, of course, change daily as people reach their 14-day anniversaries and can return home, and as, of course, new flights arrive into the country. For the move to Alert Level 2, we have taken the opportunity to stand up hotels away from the city centre so that we avoid the increasing occupation of the city centre as people return to work, even in a modest way, at 30 to 50% of what we may have seen before COVID-19. Our Te Pou Whakarai, or Māori response function, continues its outreach program to marae, iwi and mātawaka organisations. They do note, however, that there has been a decrease in the outreach, and that's starting to reduce as well, which is good. And just lastly, on general coordination, Auckland Transport is communicating widely about public transport use under Alert Level 2, including the importance of checking capacity of buses when planning a journey, and particularly the hygiene measures under place. And we note that they're communicating that through a video and on using public transport under Alert Level 2. And I urge you all to take a look at that and share it with your constituents as appropriate. I would also note, it'll be a subject later in this, your confidential agenda, but Auckland Council facilities over 400 are also progressively moving to open, and all parks and public places are available for the community now. So thank you very much. Appreciate your ongoing support for us during this time. Thank you.
Look, thanks very much, Mace. So you'll see actually from also what I'm going to talk about, the general approach is the emergency responses are downsizing, and we're transitioning back to normal, and we'll be carefully managing that, and often that involves a staged process, and you can see that both with the move from emergency response from council to the normal agencies such as government, but you can also see that staged or phased approach within council in terms of our return to work. So we've opened up our offices today. And we're expecting for the first 2 weeks to have around about 30% of the capacity of those offices occupied. I must admit, I walked around Albert Street in Bledisloe today. We're probably not quite at 30% this morning, but we'll be building up to 30. And then after 2 weeks, we'll be moving to 50%. And the reason for the 50% is around social distancing, deployment of health and hygiene requirements and so forth. And the 30% initially was to ensure that we've got those processes in place, that we've got a good way of working. And that concept of operational needs is impacting pretty much all that we do in terms of returning to work. We want to do it in a way that is safe for our people, but also safe for Aucklanders who might be using our facilities. We've also deployed track and tracing. So every person who comes into our facilities, whether they be staff or customers or Aucklanders, will be needing to record some information about them, so that should a COVID case emerge, we can track back who those individuals have been in touch with. Today, you will have seen the announcements around reopening of parks and playgrounds. But look, we have a very large network of facilities, some over 800 or so. It's by far the largest network that any local government unit in New Zealand manages. And it is a complex business to actually reopen those. And it's also affected by staff availability. We still have people within council who are associated with the COVID response. And we also have people who are vulnerable to COVID. So people who may be a high risk factor. And before those folk come back to work, they need to meet with their managers, and we just need to ensure that we've got a good safety plan for those people. We also need to deploy social distancing, and in situations, some of our public facilities, libraries and so forth, we've got to put in place some fairly careful regimes around that, and also contact tracing in those areas. And then finally, we also have the issue of water restrictions, which I know Council considered at its last meeting. And so some facilities, fountains, those sorts of things are not reopening because of that. So look, I'm not proposing to run through in any detail what's being reopened and so forth. We have an opportunity later on following this meeting around sort of a briefing with respect to that. And I know Claudia will take us through it at that point. But it's also fair to say that we want to ensure that we brief our local board chairs and so forth. They are the governors for many of these local services. And we've got an opportunity to do that more this afternoon. And the intention is to release more information about what's opening once we've had a chance to brief those governors. So look, I'll pass on to Phil, and he can talk a little bit about some of the work that's commencing around recovery. And this activity of recovery will increasingly become more important. We clearly have a government budget being announced this afternoon, and it will have implications, I'm sure, for recovery. And there's also quite a bit of work going on in the central government area about setting up legislation around this as well. So look, if I perhaps ask Phil just to talk through the area of recovery.
Thank you, Ian, and good morning, Mayor and councillors. I mentioned last week that we were expecting clarity about certain responsibilities in the recovery space. Truthfully, that did and didn't happen. As Ian and Mace have outlined, we are in a transition space formally between response and recovery. But there were certain other things that we were anticipating in terms of specific allocation of responsibilities for recovery activity that that we still don't have. There was a national teleconference earlier in the week, and it was made clear at that point that we may not get some of that clarity until after a cabinet meeting on the 2nd of June. it's likely that there'll be an expectation of a regional leadership group and or working group with specific responsibilities, but we don't know that for certain. In the absence of that clarity, we are continuing with our planning and making sure that we're connected in with others who have a responsibility in this space. Specifically, central government has appointed a regional lead in the social sector space under the banner Caring for Communities, and we are connected into that person and that mechanism. We have ATAP in terms of their economic development responsibility on board with us. And we're coordinating internally in terms of any recovery-related activity that council itself might take responsibility for. There are some outstanding questions until we have that clarity from government about specific responsibilities. What is the balance of responsibility between council, government, and community? Who is responsible for what costs in this realm? So it's a little unsatisfactory as we are in this transition space, but nevertheless we're continuing with our planning work. I'll leave it there, Your Worship.
Thank you very much to Mace, Ian and Phil. Thank you very much to Mace, Ian and Phil. Look, we'll go through in the normal way, I think, amalgamating comments and questions and just asking for people to keep these as brief as possible. We have been taking about an hour and a half over this session, and it'd be good if we can trim a little bit of time off that. So let's run through the list from the top to the bottom. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
No, good work, team. Keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Josephine Bartley.
Thank you again for all your work, team, and nothing further from me.
Thank you. Kathy Casey.
Hi, Ian. Can we possibly update on rough splitting? Has it been? I know there was an injection of government funds of $107 million to continue the motel placements. When does that run out, and who's monitoring the current situation?
Right. Who might have an answer on that one?
We're sitting together and we're just debating who might be best placed. Probably Mace.
Okay, Mace.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. So that will be continually reviewed by Ministry of Social Development and others in terms of that ongoing need. But there's a recognition centrally as central government that there will be an ongoing need for that. It runs out when the money runs out, but will be reassessed progressively.
Yeah, what I've heard, Councillor, from government is that they won't suddenly end that, so that you're shoveling people back out on the street. That they will maintain that accommodation for a longer period of time, but how long hasn't been defined yet.
Yeah, apologies, Your Worship. That's right. So there will be a clear handshake to agencies that will be able to provide ongoing support.
Okay. Good to hear. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Collins.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Thank you. I think I can hear Wayne in the background. Wayne, can you turn your mic off, please, or we'll hear all of your conversation, which might be interesting, but not the focus of our activity this morning. Councillor Pipacoon.
Well, thank you for the update, as always. I just wondered if there's any information you can pass on from Auckland Transport about the emergency measures that are in place and what is continued, particularly to provide safety around schools and with reduced speed limits.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. Not immediately, other than what you are already aware of, that they are continuing to do work around those or those risk sites. But I will ask ATOP if they can provide an update, and we can circulate that following this meeting.
Thank you. I think that would be useful in terms of appreciate that it's kind of being reviewed constantly, but there's no kind of easy way of finding out exactly what's on the ground.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Angela Dalton.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Darby.
Very satisfied, thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Al Filipina.
Just two questions, Your Worship, and I think it's to Ian or possibly Mace. One is how long, has there been a decision made as to how long our 0800 number will be continuing, and if it will continue in the next few months as we've discussed previously, have we put out a release in regards to when that 0800 number will cease? And just to give you some context as to why I've asked these questions is that I'm still getting calls from people who are still obviously having hardship around food especially, and it's yeah, I just want that to sort of get out, so yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Filipina, for the question. In terms of the general welfare support, we are seeing a transition to community-led welfare, which is being supported through the government's Caring for Communities program, funded through Auckland Emergency, or the portal of funding through Auckland Emergency Management, coordinating that funding. We do intend to, the phone calls, as I said, are reducing significantly. However, that need is still there. We will reduce from 7 to 7, likely reduce from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. to more like 8 till 5 in the future, but we expect the National Directive is still to retain that 0800 number for the foreseeable future, noting that people calling that will be, in some cases, quite a few cases already, referred on to other agencies such as Work and Income, MSD, TPK, other agencies. So we won't be turning that off anytime soon.
So Your Worship, so are we looking at July as a timeline, and is there a release, or has that been put on our website, the fact that it's still continuing?
My understanding, Councillor, is that around the rest of the country where the calls have dwindled to just a handful, they're phasing out now, but we would phase out, I don't know, maybe over the next 2 to 3 weeks, provided that we've got the other support measures in place to take over. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, Your Worship. It'll be a bit longer than that, but we continue to make on our website and under the National Directive that number available and known.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Chris Fletcher.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Shane Henderson.
No questions. Well done, everybody.
Councillor Richard Hills.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you all for that massive job. As you know, people have really relied on us and appreciated all the work that has been done under, circumstances and timings that would usually take weeks to set up. So thank you. My concern's probably just a comment around homelessness. If we can continue to advocate to at least keep people where they are until we have some sort of proper place to live, because I would hate for all the work and the gains those people have probably made not sleeping rough to be ruined because we've run out of money. So I really hope the government comes up on that. And the other thing just around, and it's my same comment as always, just with the conversations which may or may not be quite tough in the next few weeks around staffing levels and potential cuts and savings, I just want to make sure that we have enough support for our staff under already intense circumstances, but just while media and other organisations throw a whole lot of concerning stories and criticisms of staff levels and different things while we're trying to sort out our budget. So just want to make sure those things are in place. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tracy Mulholland.
Kia ora. Thank you. Great work, team. Just one question I've got is, will you be in a position to share similar to Auckland Transport an online video? Because I have found already feedback has been great on that, just as to where we go from here. So maybe a little bit of a summary, and if that comes from you, Your Worship, that'd be great. I'm just wondering if there's that opportunity, and I agree with what Councillor Hills was just saying. It does actually help people to engage, and it supports so that there is a level of comfort. So is there an opportunity for, say, a YouTube video clip just to say, here now, and this is where we're going and how we're still helping?
Okay.
Yes,
Nice.
I'm sure
Ian.
it's Ian Maxwell. Look, I'm sure we can certainly do something along those lines. I know our communications team have been thinking about how we can present the sort of efforts of council and where we're heading. So yes, I've no doubt we can do something along those lines.
Thank you. Councillor Daniel Newman.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Member Liane Namane. Thank you. Councillor Greg Sayers. Are you there, Greg? We've lost Greg for the moment. Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thanks, team, for your work that you've done over level 4 and 3. Huge congratulations from me, thank you, and no questions.
Thank you very much. Councillor Sharon Stewart.
Yes, just the same. I want to thank you all for all the hard work you've done, but am looking forward to the outstanding questions about what council and government are responsible for the community. So looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair David Taipari.
Kia ora, Your Worship. Just to Phil Wilson, really, in terms of the recovery plan, I'm unsure how Māori are going to be engaged through that process, and in particular when he's talking about this potential regional grouping, and also how he intends to communicate with the Independent Māori Statutory Board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil here. We're working that out currently, in truth. We have had a meeting at the end of last week with the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum to discuss expectations in that regard.
And we'll come back to Councillor Greg Sayers.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I had two screens open. I clicked the wrong one, so no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker. Wayne, we got you on the line there? We had you before. Okay, come back to Wayne. Councillor John Watson.
Back. Can I just check? Was it Ian Maxwell said that council is anticipating 50% of staff coming back to work in Albert Street or Bledisloe? Did I hear correctly on that?
It's Ian Maxwell. Thank you for the question. What we're doing is we've looked at our office, the capacity, if you like, of our office spaces. And given the need to maintain sort of physical distancing between people, we've worked out essentially how many people can fit into an office area, floor space, and we've said we can have 50% of that capacity. So all of our people will come into the offices, but they'll come in under rotation. But on any particular day, there will only be a maximum of 50% of the capacity of that particular office space.
Okay, great. I saw a gentleman from Auckland Transport on 7 Sharp or some such program, and they were urging big employers to look at flexible starting times and to try and essentially make the rush hour traffic a thing of the past. So I'm assuming that even within that 50%, we're accommodating flexi times in terms of starting. I know in normal
Yes,
times,
that's correct. Yes, that's correct. And it's and look, we are definitely part of that process of being able to try and sort of minimise the, if you like, the congestion on our roads. And we know that the bus services and the public transport services, they will not have the capacity that they normally do, and so the congestion on the roads could very well be an issue.
Okay, so just finally, Mr. Mayor, at some point in all this, it would be really good to have some sort of report or brief summary of how this has all worked for the Auckland Council, because clearly there's real possibilities here in terms of addressing some of these congestion issues Auckland-wide if we come out of this with a different way of doing work. And to date it seems to be progressing well without sort of too many hiccups or problems. And we're a big employer. We're in the city. We've been trialling this. We've been doing this with our staff. There's now perhaps an opportunity at some point to reflect on how it's gone and maybe a new way of conducting business at Auckland Council, not just of the COVID period, but longer term.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I'd certainly endorse those comments. I think that our longer-term objective has to be in the positives that we might have got out of the lockdown period. To give people more flexibility about working from home. People won't want to do that 5 days a week. They do like the social contact. It's great. I've got 3 people back in my office now. It's been very lonely up there by myself. But I think people would appreciate the chance, maybe even if it's for 1, 2, 3 days a week, if it's possible for them to work productively at home, to give them that option and opportunity, and that helps us, of course, with our congestion and our carbon emissions problems. So getting a report back, I've got the Chief Executive in the room at the moment, be good to find out how that has worked and how we can build some permanence into the flexibility of working hours and working places. So thank you for raising that. Councillor Paul Young.
No question.
Thank you. And coming back to Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, had technology problems, but I've sorted them. So 2 or 3 things. First off, it would be very helpful to have a clear picture for Aucklanders of what the circumstance looks like across Auckland as it goes to the things that we're responsible for, because that's not always that clear, and that's picking up on the comments that other councillors have made around public transport and other issues. The other issue that I've got, just a question, is what is happening in the food distribution space that council is associated with as the council effectively closes down the facility. It has been involved with that, Spark Arena or Vector Arena, and the transition that's necessary for local food banks to pick up. And then lastly, I just want to agree with the comments that John Watson has made, and that's around getting intelligence as to what the new normal looks like, how that impacts on us, and quite obviously that will also flow through into the emergency budget that we're preparing and the long-term plan that no doubt councillors are working on.
Okay, is that a question for Mace or Ian?
So Mace will pick up the question there.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Thanks for the question. So yes, there is a transition from the Spark Arena Distribution Centre. We are providing other grants through the central government's Caring for Communities program and working with MSD to ensure that community-led food banks and welfare organisations are getting that support, and our group welfare manager is working directly with those organisations to ensure that handshake occurs and no one should be left in need.
Do you have a contact there?
So if you spoke to Greg Morgan, our Group Welfare Manager, Councillor Walker, he will be able to give you an update on how we're doing it.
Okay, thank you very much, councillors, and thank you very much to Ian, Mace and Phil for those reports. Sharon Stewart, if I can get you to move that we receive the report and to thank our officers, and I'll second that. You happy to move that, Sharon?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I declare that carried. We now come to item number 9 on the agenda, which is the Auckland Transport Alignment Project 2020 update, where we're asked to endorse the rationale, the scope and the proposed process for ATAP, and also to endorse the draft terms of reference. You'll note on B, from the chair, I've moved an amendment to make explicit that improving resilience and sustainability of the transport system involves significantly reducing the greenhouse gas emissions it generates. That's already in several parts of the report, but wasn't actually in the terms of reference, and with a discussion with several councillors, I know that there was a desire to make that explicit, and I agree with that. So perhaps I'll move and ask for a seconder for this.
Richard.
Oh, sorry, I've got Councillor Darby that just beat you to the gun there, Councillor Hills. So moved myself, seconded Councillor Darby. And if I can ask Robert Simpson and Zining Wee, are you both on the line?
I am, Your Worship.
And I understand that you've got a presentation, a bullet point presentation, an overhead to give us.
We do. I'll
thank you. I'll pass it to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Right, apologies. This worked perfectly in our run through a couple of minutes ago.
It's always the way.
Can you see a slide?
That's on the screen now.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll put that onto slide mode. Here we go. Excellent. Sorry about that. We're ready to go. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. As the Mayor mentioned, my name is Robert Simpson. I'm the manager of the Transport Strategy team here at Council. I'm joined in this presentation today by my colleague Zining Wee. And for questions afterwards, our manager, David Hawkey, who's manager of Transport Infrastructure and Growth Strategy here at the Council, will join us to help out with some of the questions. So before we get on to the actual update itself, I thought it worthwhile just providing a little bit of background, a bit of a recap on what ATAP is and just as importantly, what it isn't. So ATAP started life, or was first mooted back in about 2014. And in 2016, the first ATAP 10-year investment package was produced. The thinking behind the development of ATAP was, of course, at the time there was quite an impasse between central government and the council as to transport priorities for Auckland. So ATAP provided a process by which the two could come together, agree, first of all, what the challenges are, agree a common evidence base, because we didn't even have that at the time, and then out of that produce an agreed set of priorities and investments over a 10-year period. This update that we're about to embark on is in fact the fourth iteration of ATAP, so it's proved its worth and it has endured over the last half decade or so. A couple of important features to note. One is that it has no statutory standing, so you'll find ATAP not mentioned in any of the legislation pertaining to local government. There's no legislated relationship between the ATAP process and the documents that come out of ATAP and any of the other statutory transport planning documents that we have around. However, as I say, it has endured, and the reason for that is because it still remains the only tool by which central and local government can get together and agree their shared set of priorities and a shared set of investments for Auckland. And clearly that's very important, given that both parties provide an awful lot of money for transport here in Auckland. That second bullet point is also equally as important. It doesn't replace any of the existing statutory processes, such as the RLTP, that's the Regional Land Transport Plan, our own long-term plan, the government's GPS. It doesn't replace any of those documents. It augments them. It both reflects and drives them. And finally, ATAP it is a long-term document. It sets out an explicit investment program over a 10-year period, but it looks beyond that as well. It looks over a 30-year period, albeit at a less detailed level for decades 2 and 3. So just to reiterate a little more on the relationship between ATAP and some of the other strategic documents. So it takes direction from a number of strategic documents from both the council and government side. On our side, of course, is the Auckland Plan, and the transport chapter in there sets out our priorities for transport in Auckland over a 30-year period. The equivalent on the government side is, of course, the GPS, and you considered our submission on the GPS last week. And that's the document by which government sets out its transport priorities, including those that it has for Auckland. So ATAP brings these two important documents together. But ATAP also reflects a whole range of other strategic documents produced by Council, AT, and also jointly with government, and we've listed them, some of them there in that top box for you. Just highlighting some of these documents, of course, there's a two-way relationship with these three documents I've got on the bottom of the screen here. And that ATAP both informs and reflects these documents. So if we just look at the Regional Land Transport Plan, for example, so this is updated every 3 years, sets out a 10-year investment program for Auckland, and it is due for renewal at the end of the next financial year, so that's the end of June next year. Since ATAP has been a thing, since it came along, the RLTP has closely reflected the investment program set out in ATAP, and we'd expect that to be the case this time around as well. So as I mentioned, there have been 3 previous iterations of ATAP. This will be the 4th. The first 2 were a little different than the third one in that they set out an investment program but weren't necessarily explicit about how it would be funded. So there was a funding gap, and that in the 2017 that funding gap was in the order of $5.9 billion. So the first ATAP was produced in 2016. It was updated just a year later when Auckland's growth outstripped what was expected, so it was deemed necessary to update it then. And of course, with the new government coming in 2017, it was updated again in early 2018. And as I say, this was a bit different than the previous 2 iterations in that the investment package was fully funded. It was to the tune of $28 billion over 10 years. And now there's a need 2 years later to update it again, the plan was to update it anyway, but of course with the COVID crisis, then the rationale becomes even more compelling as to why an update is needed. And my colleague Zeneng Wee will go into that in a minute. In terms of the governance of ATAP, at least 3 different tiers, at least that's how we've organised it here. So political oversight is provided at its highest level, of course, by yourselves, the governing body, and Cabinet. So any decisions that are needed in relation to the recommended investment package are taken by the governing body and Cabinet. Of course, this is quite a fast-moving process, so we require officers require direction on a weekly basis, really. And so the practice in the past has been for the council to delegate the mayor, the deputy mayor, and the chair of the planning committee to provide that flexibility, to provide that political direction on a more frequent basis than is possible through the committee structure. But as I say, all decisions pertaining to the recommended investment package do come back to the full governing body. The highest level of governance on the officers' side is, of course, provided by the chief executives and from a range of agencies, and you'll see some of them listed there, including ourselves, of course, and AT. And so their role is to be the ultimate, that they, on the officer side, to approve the package that we'll put forward to yourselves, and also to approve the different methodologies that we come up with and so on. Just one particular point to highlight there, and that whilst there has always been well-established protocols and processes for engagement with Māori at the project level, it's something that has been lacking in previous ATAPs at the overall program level. And in recognition of the need to address this, the chief executives at one of their meetings prior to the lockdown resolved to engage with both mana whenua and matawaka in a far more comprehensive level, and that process had started prior to the lockdown, and I understand it has been delayed a bit, obviously, over the last month or so. And then beneath that, of course, there are a whole range of different project teams, each of which has a specific task in relation to the update. And my colleague, Ximeng Wei, who I'll now hand over to, will take you through some of that detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So there are a number of emerging issues which have given rise to the need to update ATAP. Firstly, there's a need to establish a new funding baseline as a result of the significant impacts of COVID-19 on council and government revenue streams. In addition, the recent and pending government announcements around transport investment in Auckland will also have an impact on the ATAP funding envelope, which need to be worked through in greater detail. Secondly, priorities around climate change and mode shift outcomes have become increasingly important for both council and government. In terms of climate change, both council and government have made commitments to reduce carbon emissions. And so there is a need to ensure that Auckland's transport investment reflects these priorities and commitments. Thirdly, there is a need to ensure that ATAP is able to help inform the upcoming statutory plans, such as the Regional Land Transport Plan and the Long-Term Plan. And finally, there is a need to ensure that ATAP is able to both inform and reflect the recent and pending transport investment decisions made by government. So, for example, there was the New Zealand Upgrade Programme that was announced in February this year, as well as any upcoming economic stimulus packages to be announced. It's also important to note that ATAP will not replace any statutory processes or decision-making by Council or Auckland Transport. There are established consultation mechanisms involved with these statutory processes, but rather ATAP will seek to inform these processes. So next slide, please, Rob. Thanks. So the ATAP 2020 update will be guided by the shared Council and Crown objectives for transport in Auckland. The objectives shown in this slide here, and which are also covered in the terms of reference, comprise of an amalgamation of existing strategic objectives for transport in Auckland, and they're all highly consistent with key strategic documents such as the Auckland Plan and the GPS. The objectives here were developed as part of Future Connect, which is a process to kickstart the development of the RLTP. And these objectives are around enabling and supporting Auckland's growth and the quality compact urban approach, accelerating better travel choices, better connecting people, places, goods, and services, improving the resilience and sustainability of the transport system. I would note that if the Mayor's amendment, if passed, this bullet point here would seek to emphasize climate emissions and climate change. I would also note that there is a specific work stream around climate change in the ATAP 2020 update, which aims to provide a climate lens over the investment package, and that this work stream is led by Auckland Council. The other objectives are around making Auckland's transport system safe and also ensuring value for money. I would also note that the included in the terms of reference is the fact that ATAP 2020 will have to consider climate change and mode shift outcomes mentioned earlier, any emerging brownfield and greenfield priorities and their transport requirements, as well as the broader priorities outlined in strategic documents such as the Auckland Plan and the GPS. Next slide, please. In terms of the project scope and approach, there are a few steps involved. So the initial focus of the update will be to establish the baseline funding that is currently available. And this step is really critical, as the prioritization process to develop an indicative transport investment package can only take place once we understand what is the funding that is available. And this process will also include the identification of projects that have a level of commitment to them, which means that they will not be part of the prioritization process, but will carry on. It's also important to note that the degree to which the budget is already committed would obviously constrain our ability to reprioritize the package to align with additional priorities. Secondly, there will be a range of investment and funding scenarios which will be developed, and that is to account for the increasing funding uncertainty caused by COVID-19. The transport projects will then be assessed and prioritized against the shared ATAP objectives, which I mentioned earlier. And this step will also include the identification of any potential trade-offs between the objectives. There will also be a need to identify any variation to the regional fuel tax that will need to occur. So this will be largely because some of the projects that were partly funded by the RFT have also been included in government packages, such as the New Zealand Upgrade Programme that was announced by government earlier this year. So there will be a need to identify the implications on the RFT. And finally, there's a need to ensure that any transport stimulus packages are consistent with shared ATAP objectives, and to also assess the implications of these packages for ATAP itself. There will be two phases to the ATAP update. So the first phase has already been kickstarted, and it aims to provide a detailed investment package for the first decade. So that's 2021 to 2023, and there will be a particular focus on the first 3 years. Phase 2 is focused on the latter decades, decades 2 and 3, and will aim to provide a more indicative investment package. I'll note that the update is not intended to undermine projects that are already underway or have a strong level of commitment, and that is to ensure that there is no loss of momentum for the ATAP package. Next slide, please. Just briefly then on the terms of reference, which you have attached to the report in front of you. So the terms of reference, they reflect the drivers underlying the update, the priorities of council and government, which I covered earlier, the approach that the update will take, as well as the focus of the 6 work streams which have been developed. The terms of reference are a timely and efficient way to allow for direction setting from the ATAP political sponsors. They have been approved by the ATAP governance group, and we're currently seeking endorsement from the emergency committee to approve the draft terms of reference. And so the last slide is around recommendations and next steps. So we are recommending that the emergency committee endorse the rationale, scope, and proposed process, endorse the draft terms of reference, and also delegate authority to the mayor, deputy mayor, and the chair of the planning committee to provide political oversight throughout the process. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, phase 1 has already started, and it will be completed by August. Although note that because of the election period, central government will not be able to make or adopt decisions until the end of this year. The second phase will aim to be completed before June next year to allow us to be able to inform the statutory processes of the LTP and the RLTP. So thank you for that, and we're happy to take questions now. And as Rob noted, we're also joined by David Hawkey. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert and Si-Ning. That was a very good and a very full presentation. So I think everybody will be able to get their heads around what's required in a pretty straightforward way. The change that I've put in there, it is already mentioned. It already mentions climate change under 4.2, and it's one of the work streams. But I think because this is consistent with both council and government's position, and because it's so important, with transport making up 43% of Auckland's emissions, I think it deserves to be explicit in the terms of reference as well. Right, I think the best way of going through this will be to take questions and comments together, and again I'll simply work through the list of councillors, because I've already had some indication that a number of councillors do want to ask questions or make comments on it. So we'll take our roll call in reverse order this time. Councillor Paul Young.
No comment, no question now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor John Watson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I think Rob, mentioned in terms of the delegation there, the need for flexibility and political direction. I think he said almost on a weekly basis, and I understand that at some point in this, I'm not it comes back to the governing body for approval, but of course there's a bit of water that goes under the bridge in that intervening period, and I noticed from the slide that the governing body's put on the same pedestal as the cabinet, which is most complimentary. But in terms of communications with the governing body over that period of time, what is an appropriate mechanism then for keeping us up to date with what the flavour of those discussions are, given that obviously things are subject to change, and some of those changes might be dramatic. It would be very desirable that the kind of flavour of negotiations or talks were conveyed in some way over that period, so that we have a sense of what's happening, rather than just the smaller delegated group.
So that might be to David or to Robert.
Yeah.
It could be that if it might be useful during that process to have a workshop where we could have a wider discussion than normally takes place in formal planning committee or governing body. But your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Councillor. David Hawkey here. I suppose what I would envision is, as we do the work and we report to the delegated smaller group, we would take guidance on when we would need to connect with the wider governing body. For example, could it be a workshop or something more formal? And there'll be some milestones through the process that probably would be a good time for such a report back. And I suppose the first one in my mind would be a report back on what's the understanding of the ATAP partners on what COVID-19 means for the overall funding package, for example. So I suppose having the smaller group is a part of getting that guidance when we would return to the bigger group sort of thing.
I guess then, just at the risk of stating the obvious, obviously, this is a very important process and it's going over a period of time. So, I'm assuming for the comments that I've heard that, there is going to be reporting back along the way, so that people are availed of, some of the key developments that are occurring, if, given the constraints it's still working under, and then it just doesn't come back at the end with, this is what we've decided type of thing, vote on it. So, from what I'm hearing...
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. That's noted. I think it's very important that we ensure we do our best, that people are informed of the key findings as we go along.
Right. Thank you.
And Councillor, you're quite right. We've got the political oversight group of a couple of ministers and three councillors, two councillors and myself. A bit of pressure actually for us to cut that number down, because we outweigh that steering group. But in the end, it's Cabinet and this governing body that makes the decision. So, I think it will be good to come back maybe in July before we officially report back the following month, just to let people know where things are going, and within the extent that we have the flexibility to raise points that haven't yet been agreed, because there's a degree of sensitivity around that. Just to get feedback from councillors and input by councillors at that time. Councillor Wayne Walker.
A couple of comments, and I see the mention around obviously climate change, resilience and sustainability. The suggestion that I put is that we mention both mitigation That's around reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the imperative of dealing with climate change adaptation, because that has significant impacts around the need to raise parts of our transport system and make it more resilient. So I guess my comment is we could be a little bit more explicit there. And the reason for that is that I remain hugely sceptical that we are adequately planning for adaptation and the speed around that adaptation, which appears to be needing to accelerate because of sea level rise. The other ongoing concern I've got is the real need for an evidence base, because we don't see that sufficiently across the light rail versus heavy rail discussion. That remains an ongoing concern, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks for those points, Councillor. And yeah, the word resilience there is a particular reflection on the need that we'll have for adaptation as well as mitigation. I just need to say about that amendment, it's a little unusual to amend the terms of reference after they've been through the governing group, but I thought that was necessary, and I've consulted with a couple of members of the governing group. I think we won't have to reinitiate the whole process to have what we've got so far there amended. But I don't want to test the agreement and patience of the other side of our partnership too much by making too many changes. IMSB Chair David Taipere.
Kia ora, Your Worship. So I just want to acknowledge the Māori impact statement, which I think is very good in the report, but doesn't quite align with the terms of reference. So the question I have is that, you know, in terms of acknowledging that Māori haven't really been in the tiers, and there is has been presented this morning, there's some process that was started pre-COVID-19. I would like to know, I would like to see the terms of reference actually reflecting that. I can't see how that can sort of be translated out from our report and not be in the terms of reference. And the other matter is, and I've taken on board what you've already said about things have already been done and set in place to a point. But I truly believe that the board should be part of the political oversight group. And without giving myself any more duties, I would propose that the chair of the Independent Māori Statutory Board be part of the political oversight group. And on that basis, Your Worship, I would propose that as an amendment.
Your Worship, Leanne Lamine, I'm happy to second that.
Thank you, David and Leanne. I just need to repeat probably what I said before you made that comment, David, that the feedback we were getting from the partnership was that already on the political steering group we had 3 elected representatives as against 2 ministers, and I think there'd be a real reluctance from the government side for us to increase our representation. I have no objection in principle, but I do have the practical problem that I don't think that we're going to get agreement from the government side to have twice as many representatives as they have at a ministerial level. David, have you got any comments that you want to make on that?
Thank you, Honour. I agree. My understanding, we've based it off what has worked in the past, which is really, I suppose, a smaller number of councillors and the 2 ministers. And I suppose, I don't know at the political level, but the feedback I have received at the, I suppose, the officer level and the official level was they didn't want to have a greater number. So I think you're right, Your Honour. I think it would be a difficult thing to do.
Well,
I've been elevated to judicial status there. Sorry, Member Taipere?
Yes, please. Well, honestly, I'm surprised the government doesn't want to include Māori. I want to know whether council would support that. And again, that's why I proposed the amendment. I mean, I don't want to make it any more cumbersome than it is, but I think it should be a robust political steering group. And again, it's a bit difficult trying to talk about myself in particular because of the role I have. But in principle,
I think that should be a consideration that this council should be putting forward. And this is where the Independent Māori Statute Board is part of the Auckland Council Act. So it's not like we're some extreme third party. We're actually part of the whole structure. And you know, we've been playing a role throughout that in terms of advice around transport and the likes. And it currently, as it sits, when you go through the tiers, there is no Māori. So again, Your Worship, I respect the wishes of government, but this is a council meeting which we're part of, and I would again say that I propose that as amendment, which I already have moved, and Leanne seconded, and I would prefer that went to the vote. Thank you.
That's of course you're right to do that. The other option would be to have the co-chair of the governance group, which is our Chief Executive Stephen Town, raise that with the government to say that would be our desire. Would they agree to that? Because we can't make that change unilaterally. But you can go ahead with the amendment if that's what you're absolutely intent on doing. I think making an informal approach to government with an encouragement for the government agreement would probably be a better way of dealing with it. But Stephen, I don't know whether you want to make any comment on that at all.
Just to add, through you, Chair Phil, that it is Auckland Council that has initiated the conversation. And we were partway through the process, and that got interrupted by COVID-19. So we will just pick it up. So we're kind of in the middle of that process right now, and we would intend to pick it up now that we're moving back to more normal face-to-face conversations and meetings. But it is a bit out of step with the timing of approving the terms of reference, again, just because of COVID-19.
David, I don't know whether you want to make any response to that.
No further response from me.
No, sorry, the other David Typery.
Well, I'm not really sure what Stephen said other than the timing, and I guess my question about that is, if we'd been involved and communicated about this a lot earlier, you would have got that from us from the beginning, only to reflect a robust political steering group. So, again, I take on board that this group is not the decision maker, but the respective groups that make it up, i.e. the governing body of council and cabinet or parliament, are the decision makers. And so I would have thought the inclusion of the chair of the Independent Māori Statute Board would have no effect in a voting capacity, but would be there to provide guidance around those matters.
If there was, I haven't got an amendment in front of me, but I presume it would be something along the lines of ask the governance group to consider the addition to the political oversight group of the chair of the IMSB. Is that the nature of the amendment?
Well, that's certainly the objective, Your Worship, and my simple idea was just to put it in C, or add it to C. I mean, the other question is whether council as a whole support that as well. And I guess the amendment would reflect that, whether it was voted through or not. I mean, I understand the nuances that go with all this, but I think it would be, I'm keen to find out whether council are supportive of such a robust approach, and if they are, then go through the processes of talking to government. If my point of view is if it falls over, then that's something we need to discuss without trying to collapse what's been intended here. But I think council should be reflecting inclusivity. Kia ora.
Kia ora. So what my suggestion is the wording of an amendment would be a D, which is ask the governance group to consider the addition of the chair of the IMSB to the political steering group. And I've got no objection in principle to the IMSB being on it, but I have had I think officers have had a very clear indication from the government that they don't wish to increase the size of the group. That does not stop us from asking. So if you're happy with the wording that I've suggested, I'll get Sandra to put that up as an amendment. If you've got, she's just working on that now, and then we would need to have a discussion at this point around the amendment.
Okay, Your Worship. I'll go with that.
Okay, so just repeating for Sandra, the wording would be ask the governance group to consider the addition of the chair of the IMSB to the political steering group. So that's an amendment moved by David Taiperi, seconded by Leanne Ngamane, and I'll just ask for any speakers to that amendment.
Yes, Mayor. Chris Darby.
Councillor Darby.
Mayor, I just note that the weighting of the governance group itself is 5-2 in favour of the government. So any argument against this on the basis that it weights it in our favour is somewhat of a reversal of the argument that, you know, might be put against. Well, my suggestion was coming up through questioning that we needed to look at the governance group itself because of its extreme government weighting. So look, what I'm arriving at here is that I'm supporting this amendment. I think the more inclusive we can be, the better. And I don't think it unduly weights that political reference group in favour of Auckland Council. Just as the government would probably say that the governance group is not unduly weighted in their favour when it comes to the 5-2 participation, government and council representatives on the governance group. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. As I say, this is the feedback that we've got. That's not to stop us asking for it. So I'll just take some other speakers. I've got Councillor Angela Dalton and then Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Oh, sorry, unmute. Yes, look, I'd like to support the amendment. I don't think the argument is about whether it's weighted towards government or weighted towards Auckland. I think it's about Māori having a voice, and that's for the country. That's not just for Auckland or local government or central government. So I will support this amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for allowing me to speak to this amendment, which I support. What I do want to draw attention to, and having been at the birth of ATAP, transport policy for years was skewed because, in my opinion, and you might think this trivial, but in actual fact it's had a real impact with change, that it has been male-dominated by way of decision-making. It's been primarily engineers, and sometimes it was difficult to get through the nuances of caregivers and their requirements with regard to public transport. I support David Taiperi's amendment, but I want to draw attention to the fact that you have two government ministers, both of whom are male. We have yourself, with no disrespect, Councillor Darby and the Deputy Mayor, all men. And I do think that when you are looking at and whether there is an intention to do a reset in light of the situation that we've been through, I would like to understand that at a governance level, whilst we've done all we can to ensure at a board level for Auckland Transport there is a greater representation of women, I am unhappy with the fact that it will be exclusively men who at a governance level are going to bring back the recommendations to the governing body. And I would just like you to take that on board when you are looking into the future. I'm not promoting myself. I'm very happy with the way that ATAP has gone, and I think that Bill Cashmore, when he was invited to be our representative on ATAP, did a very fine job. But there are issues that women have found with public transport. It might be safety, it might be issues to do with handicap, it might be, And I want to ensure that that voice is heard. So I just ask you to take that into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I've got one more, Councillor, and I think probably you'll find that most people are in agreement with making this request. So I'll take Professor Collins, who's asked for the call, and then open it up for anybody opposed to the amendment. If not, I'll put the amendment at that point, firstly on the voices. Councillor Collins.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Sir, I just wanted to ask if we were, I'm supportive of the amendment, but I wanted to ask if we were set on the three persons we have at the moment, being yourself, the Deputy Mayor and the Chair of Planning. So I think if, I'm not saying that one of you should pull out, but if there was some kind of agreement amongst yourselves as to who the three could be, then we might avoid having to go to the amendment. That was my question.
I think we need to go to the amendment because it relates to the IMSB member. The reason for the composition of the three are that as Mayor, I have to have that direct relationship with Cabinet Ministers and do on a regular basis. Councillor Darby is Chair of the Planning Committee, and Councillor Darby and Deputy Mayor Cashmore are both our liaison officers on the Auckland with Auckland Transport. So it wasn't selected on any reason other than the positions that were held by the three incumbents on that. Let me just ask if there's any speakers against the amendment.
I have a question.
Okay, Councillor Walker.
So my question is just around how things work practically. My understanding is that the IMSB is on the planning committee, that the IMSB has interaction with council generally. So if this exercise around ATAP is around our engaging with government and the necessity for council to have a unified view, and in that respect I include IMSB, then does this mean that the IMSB effectively bypasses the council process and the planning committee process? So how does this work pragmatically? Because quite obviously we want to ensure that we've got an efficient process that's representative of a collaboration between the council and the IMSB first.
I don't think it means anything about bypassing the normal processes of the planning committee. It simply would represent a Māori voice on the political steering group, which is referred to in the paper about the partnership with Māori. It doesn't bypass anything, in my opinion. Okay, I think
my other question is just around the engagement with local boards that sit alongside council.
Well, we have that process of engagement anyway, but this is a governing board matter. It's determined at that level. And of course, on all transport issues, there is the normal channels for engagement between local boards and the governing body on that issue, which is clearly an important issue for the city as a whole. So, look, there appears to be no speakers in opposition, so I'll put the amendment.
I was going to speak against it, Your Worship.
Oh, okay, sorry, Councillor Newman. I'd asked before, but I hadn't had an indication. Councillor Newman?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's an interesting discussion, Your Worship, but I mean, I will request that my vote against the amendment be recorded. As we move forward, I see the direction of funding and planning moving increasingly away from Auckland Council to central government. I think this reflects our deteriorating funding position, B, a greater reliance on central government for both funding and also central government taking a much greater role in relation to planning. So, I mean, I can actually understand why that you've had feedback about the representation
where those ministers are outnumbered by local government elected members. I do support you, Your Worship, and I support the Deputy Mayor representing the Council's interests, reflecting on what Councillor Collins said. I'm not quite sure why we're outnumbering ministers. I think the issue here, to my mind, is the need to ensure that we get an appropriate interface with the governing body. I mean, there are very significant budgetary implications to ATAP, but I don't want to go into a budgetary debate on a transport funding envelope where my role is to vote to appropriate a budget to enable ATAP, but for which I don't have any direct political input because I'm not on that political working party, reference group, whatever it is. And never mind planning, the government is already centralising planning through legislation. So I think that the oversight group is actually fairly favourable to us at the moment, and I can understand why ministers would be, why government would be pushing back in terms of them being outnumbered by us. They will be funding more and more of Auckland's transport needs, I suspect, in a post-COVID-19 world. And I think that, I do want to ensure that we get a good broad representation, but I think that the balance is actually already in our favour.
Thank you, Councillor. And as I said before, and we'll just repeat here, that this is a proposal to the other side of the partnership, but it's not a decision we can make unilaterally, but it is a proposal we can put to them. I've had an indication from Councillor Filipaina that you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Look, my question is, if or when this gets passed and you go back to the governance group and they say no, the numbers are correct from our perspective, and this doesn't happen where the chair is on the political steering group, is that the end of the matter then? Namely, the independent Māori Statutory Board chair will not be on the political steering group?
The ATAP is a joint partnership between council and government, and if either side objects to any proposal, that proposal doesn't go forward. It's built around finding agreement and consensus, most obviously in the sort of projects that are prioritised, but also in the nature of the process that is followed. So we can't impose our position on them. Equally, they can't impose their position on us. That's how it works, and I can't think of any other way in which you could sensibly make that work. So I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, Your Worship, is this the long way to say that if the governance group end up saying, as in the central government ministers say no, that's the end of it now, and I just didn't know whether the independent Māori Statutory Board chair knew that.
Yeah, no, it's important to note that there has to be agreement from both sides of the partnership for a change in process or a decision in terms of prioritisation of the projects that are being accepted. So you're quite right to draw attention to that. Look, unless somebody requests a division, I will put the vote on the voices, noting that Councillor Newman wishes to have his vote recorded against it, and
Walker.
And Walker.
Your Worship, I wish to abstain on this vote because I don't think the issues that I have wanted to see addressed have been addressed. Thank you.
An abstention from Councillor Fletcher. I'll put the vote now, and if there are any other votes wanting to be recorded against or abstaining, please let me know. So it's been moved by Member Taipari, seconded by Member Nāmane. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
To the contrary, no.
No. No.
Okay, I declare that carried, and I've got 2 votes recorded against and 1 abstention. Is there any other vote to be recorded against or an abstention? If not, we'll move back to the amendment now becomes part of the substantive motion, and the next councillor is Councillor Sharon Stewart. questions or comments, Councillor?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thanks, Your Worship. Look, I've got one question and a suggestion. My question first is back onto the project objectives, ensuring value for money across Auckland's transport system through well-targeted investment choices. The officers talking about that sort of said that talked about that in the same sentence as safety. And my question was just exactly to get some clarification from a staff perspective what they meant by value for money through targeted investment choices. What sort of value for money? Were they talking about savings in cash or efficiencies, or what exactly did they mean around that? That's my first question, and then I have a suggestion.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor. The value for money really is, as the package comes together, we're trying to understand, I suppose, when you look at almost the cost and benefits of the intervention. So you're getting, I suppose, you're putting your money in on things that will get you the best movement to those outcomes. So it's not really like we're doing things to save money. It's more a part of that prioritisation. It's sort of, I suppose, it's the economic part of the prioritisation, if you want to think about it that way.
Thank you for that clarification. My suggestion is, and it's done just listening to actually what Councillor Fletcher has said, and I just wondered whether the Chair of Planning would think about substituting the Deputy Chair of Planning to solve that problem. I'm not going to amend it, make an amendment. It's just a suggestion that as you go through the questions, those two might have a little bit of a chat offline. Diversity is important, and it's something we all promote. And I suppose now it's been pointed out to me how little diversity potentially they have from a gender perspective. It might be a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'll simply take that as a suggestion, and that could be the topic of a conversation between the Chair and the Deputy Chair of the Planning Committee. Next question or comment, Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you very much. Through you, Chair. My question really got answered earlier by, asked and answered by Councillor Watson, but I would like to just note that I have no objection to the inclusion of the Independent Ngārahu Statutory Board becoming, or asking if they can be part of that group.
Thank you, Councillor. Member Leanne Namane.
Order. I guess just one question, and it's not necessarily subject to the amendment that's made before, but, you know, the report by Council, in particular paragraph 38, page 16, does sum up, I guess, where the gaps are at the moment as relates to strong representation from mana whenua mātāwaka, role as a treaty partner, incorporation of Mātauranga Māori and a Te Ao Māori worldview. And then I look to the draft terms of reference and I don't see any of that in there. I'm not looking for an amendment. I guess I'm looking for clarification on how that may be addressed, that gap, within the context of the terms of reference.
Okay, could I have a officer's comment on that, please?
Ning, do you want to speak to that one, perhaps?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm not sure how to address that. What was included in the report, I guess, was recognition from the governance group, as the chief executive talked about earlier, in terms of how it could be better reflected in the terms of reference. Is that something that we could table through this meeting for it to be better reflected? I'm not sure.
I think Member Namane was just making that as a question and a suggestion. But that's maybe something that officers could give some further thought to.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think it's important because we've identified as a council some what I think are significant gaps. Were the previous amendment to be successful and the IMSB chair become part of that, I guess in some respect that alleviates that gap to an extent, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the draft terms of reference has nothing in it in relation to Māori. And I guess I leave that with you as a suggestion that it actually does somehow need to be incorporated.
Thank you very much, Member Namane. So I'll just refer that to officers to give some further consideration to. Councillor Daniel Newman.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I guess moving forward, and I mean, officers may be able to comment in the future, or maybe this is more of a political discussion, that to me the ATAP works best when there is a real sense of alignment with the RPS provisions of the Auckland Unitary Plan, the Quality Compact City, and the need to adhere planning to give effect to that. What I am unsure of is the appetite that central government has to use the statutory powers that it is vesting in itself through the changes of legislation to make exceptions where it deems fit, particularly in relation to the rural-urban boundary and new developments at locations beyond the rub, or certainly wanting to reprioritise investment within the future urban areas. And because
I've lost Daniel.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Councillor Newman, we've lost you. We've had that problem before. Maybe if you could just come back in again and recommence from about 30 seconds ago. Thank you.
Okay, so for me, I want to understand as we move forward with this refreshed exercise as to the level of discipline that central government can give to a focus on achieving the objectives of the Auckland Unitary Plan around the RPS, because if we get exceptions for new developments out of sequence or in wrong locations, that is going to have significant budgetary implications which aren't necessarily favourable for the council.
Thank you, Councillor. I can respond to that. I think there are very important observations there. My response would be we have got the applying the compact quality approach to growth in as one of the key objectives. We actually also have established a work stream that is to look at urban development in particular in terms of space, what it means spatially, and that is led by Auckland Council. There's been no indication to me so far in any of my dealings with government about such things as out-of-sequence growth or anything like that. So I'm not aware of any desire to do such things. And we do, I suppose, setting up the, having the work stream, which is led by Auckland Council to understand the spatial sort of implications of this, I suppose, process, gives me some comfort that I think we'll well understand such things. So, and we would be definitely bringing such things back if that were to emerge.
Well, thank you, David. And I'd just make the point, Your Worship, that I would imagine that as we do move into the recovery, there will be significant pressure from private investor interest to government directly to look at exceptions where it might be commercially viable for that to take place, but which doesn't necessarily align with the strategic direction set out in the RPS provisions of the Auckland Unitary Plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. And as you'll be aware, the paper that was done by our chief economist on the RUB was sent to the government and had a muted response, but the removal of the RUB has not been in the speeches of ministers recently, and I hope that that's a good indication that they understand that the original proposal to remove the RUB was founded on research that was less thorough and less relevant than what Council itself has come up with. But it's a fair point that you make. Councillor Tracy Mulholland.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I support this.
Thank you very much. Councillor Richard Hills.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I don't see probably much change coming through the process anyway, since we've set up every other document to line up. And thank you for adding the resilience, sustainability and climate change in there, as it's clearly something that we have agreed on unanimously, and the government pretty much unanimously across the Parliament as well with the Zero Carbon Act. It's just clear that we need to drive this harder, especially as transport is our number one emitter for Auckland, and with jobs and growth in the agricultural space after COVID, that I believe that transport has to be our target for emissions, while agriculture is needs to take a back step from the forces of that while we deal with jobs and growth in that way. So transport is in my opinion, easy one through infrastructure and funding from government to address our emissions, and faster.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Shane Henderson.
Oh, I'm okay, thanks. I did have a couple of questions, but they're non-urgent. That's totally fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. The questions that I had were ones that have actually been posed by Councillor Newman. But I would ask you to reflect on the fact that the change to getting funding available from central and local government into public transport was really hard fought for. And to a degree, when you have change, you can tend to take it for granted. I would suggest that the fact that we saw those incredible patronage figures, and ATAP was primarily driven by the need to get government on board with the CRL. I just don't think you should ever take change for granted. It was brought about in many ways because of a diversity of thinking. So I welcome, I really genuinely welcome the need for that voice in terms of Māoridom. But I think that there is the need for the voice of women as well, especially with public transport. So I hope that you can take that on board, and that we can see support for a continuation of diversity in terms of representation at a governance level. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And it was a huge improvement, as the presenters put out in the bullet point presentation before, that we closed. And Councillor Deputy Mayor Cashmore knows this better than most. We closed a 5.9 billion gap in the funding for ATAP. That was a huge achievement back in 2018, and I absolutely don't take that for granted, because the New Zealand Transport Agency, when they got into trouble, the first thing they wanted to do was to start to resile from some of that commitment. And fortunately, again, at a political level, we were able to get that removed, and we have in the government policy statement now an explicit commitment to ATAP and to the 16.3 billion that the government had earlier committed to make. So it's a fair point. Councillor Alf Filipaina.
No, I'm all good, Your Worship. I just had that question from the previous edition that's been made.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Chris Darby.
Thanks, Matt. Just took me a while to find things there. Thanks. Look, I just want to remind people that this is normally a planning committee report, and it's coming here, of course, to the emergency committee today. I want to reiterate that just due to the speed of things in 2018, we didn't get this opportunity. We didn't go through this process. There was no such report. There was no equivalent report to the planning committee at that time, and it was just because of the haste of having to move on the 2018 ATAP. So members, some members have stressed the need for ongoing visibility. This is just the beginning of the visibility that I discussed with officers and you, Your Worship, which you were totally supportive of from sort of November, December, when we realised that we had to update ATAP. So this political socialisation that has been stressed here today will be carrying on through the planning committee. I just want to stress that it's great to see that climate change is just not given SOP words anymore. And the amendment here today reflects some emails that I've sent in the last couple of weeks, and significantly reducing emissions. I was going to say commissions. Significantly reducing emissions is totally appropriate. That they are very precise and powerful words being amended there. Totally support that. Along with the emphasis on mode shift, quality compact city, brownfield priorities, safety, environmental resilience, and that's all important. Look, I am going to support this entirely. I hope others can as well. And then I have just a few questions here, Mayor, and I will just run through them. I just want to emphasize, I just want to check really. We often get bogged down in identifying projects, as we did last time in ATAP, and even in parts of the terms of reference, it refers to projects. My question is, are the programs going to be given weight this time? Because they're not given the opening in the words at the moment. It's very project focused. So optimization and technology programs were emphasized last time, but they didn't actually get delivered on in the 2018 document. So question to David or Robert, whoever, about the programs. The second question, and I raised this in my email as well to you, Mayor, the governance group has a weighting of 5-2, the governance group itself, and that's under section 6.1 of the terms of reference. Are we comfortable with the weighting in favour of government on that governance group? It's the same as last time, as is the weighting on the political reference group, and things went swimmingly well, we could say, but are we comfortable with it this time? And my final question, Mayor, is how is accessibility and universal design picked up? Is it a subset of the terms of reference? Is that adequately addressed? They're my questions, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Maybe I'll try to work sort of from the middle question first. In terms of, why is there
David,
7?
Sorry, can I just interrupt, David? You're really
sorry, David Hawkey, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you only too well. That's the problem. Can you just step back from the microphone a little? Because
I got some feedback this morning that no one could hear me, so sorry about that.
No, we all hear you really well. So it's a little bit more quietly. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of, I suppose, the governance group, the way that has been set up is that, I suppose it comes back to one of the key letters of ATAP is alignment. So I suppose having all the CEs in the room to discuss these things and to agree on them is always seen as a very beneficial thing. In effect, I suppose the desire of the process is that we as staff, we are supposed to go into the room, put our agency's hats sort of aside as much as we can and work together, I suppose, to get something that's really good for Auckland. So I suppose that's the reason there is the number on it. Whether that's the right or wrong, that's not for me to judge, but that's the background to it. In terms of programs and projects, yes, probably projects are a bit overemphasised, but I suppose when you think about it, the absolute essence of what we're trying to do is put together an overall package that comes together to deliver those outcomes. So thinking through at a program level, and I suppose one of the reasons we also have a spatial work stream is to think spatially what that means as well, is to come together to get those outcomes there. So I suppose I've always seen it to be a lot of projects coming together to deliver an overall package of programs. So that's the way I've always looked at it, and we try to get our heads around that. In terms of I think the question about accessibility, I suppose I'll just note that because I suppose what we try to do is do the work, is apply our judgment to get these outcomes sort of thing. It probably hasn't got the words, but I mean, ensuring that there is accessibility for a diverse range of people to do what they need to do through the transport system is quite high in our minds. So I hope that answers those questions.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Mayor.
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting to put my mic on. Councillor Angela Dalton.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I just would like to pick up on what Member Ngamane was saying about the terms of reference not reflecting a reference or a relationship or commitment to Māori. And I'd like to make sure that that doesn't get lost as an action for discussion, because it was a really good question, and I want to be informed of the answer as to how that gap occurred. And because we're in planning per se, I see this as a consistent through our policies and sometimes our planning, where our intentions and our words for outcomes for Māori don't always make it through to work plans or budgets. And as a principle, it's something that we as a council family need to pay better attention to. So if I could be part of the response that comes back to Member Ngamane's question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it'd be helpful if we get a reply back to all councillors on that, but particularly members of the IMSB and Councillor Dalton as the spokesperson on Māori outcomes. Thank you very much for that. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you. I'm going to get off that composition of the committee and just talk about the terms of reference. And I put in that portmanteau word, thank you, Councillor Henderson, comment. So it's a kind of a question comment. For me, I've been quite interested listening over the last period when we've been in lockdown, etc., how people keep talking about now is a chance to do something differently. Now we're going to, and everybody sort of wants to push their own agenda, you know, using, and it is a little, this is what it feels like to me, you know, that, oh, I'm going to get on my thing, now I'm going to get on my thing. My concern is that this ATAP is about 16 plans that inform it, which were agreed to. And I worry that, and I guess this is the question that we've heard a lot about, now we've got to get on to walking and cycling. I completely support that, but I'm very concerned that we might skew it that way, because it's great in the inner suburbs, the Devonports, where you've got really good RTMs and ferries and you can walk and cycle to work. But for the outer suburbs, and I think of places like Bethel's Beach and Waitakere Township and Massey, where there's no RTN, and you can't expect these people to go to their job in Penrose walking and cycling. And that's my concern, is that we're with your added B, it sort of gives a bit of weight to let's skew it a bit another way. But there's hundreds of thousands of people that doesn't help. Good for recreation, but it's about, to me, we've got to get better RTNs. Yes, and Councillor Stewart's just put same for Howard Pakaraka and Botany. We can't walk to work, even to the city. And so I'm just hoping that your addition doesn't then say, okay, we'll put more of our money in that way instead of really getting RTN in places that it just hasn't got it now. Because there's a lot of places, and some of the members of the committee have got those great things, you know, and a lot of our constituents don't. So that's just my, I guess, comment but question, that I hope that doesn't skew it that way, because of what I've been hearing over this last 6 weeks or so, that let's sort of audition for a new future and let's use this as an opportunity to change things, because we've got 16 plans here we've already agreed to. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Perhaps as the person that put the amendment in, I could comment on that. It's not just about walking and cycling, of course, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's about electrification of fleets. It's about mode shift and all of those other things. But the reason that I thought that we did need explicit reference to that is because if we're to deal with emissions across Auckland, as we voted unanimously to deal with under the climate emergency statement, transport is the critical area, 43% of our emissions, and I think that justified it. But notwithstanding that, I think that the broad terms of reference actually look right across the board at the whole range of challenges that we've got in the transport space. So it's highlighting something that both government and council have already put an emphasis on, so that it's not lost. But I don't think it
it leads towards simply more cycling and walking. It's the whole range of things that are implicit in the need to reduce global emissions. So hopefully that might help.
That gives me a bit of comfort as long as those RTNs, I'd like to see them prioritised, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Papacoon.
Thank you. I don't have any questions, just a few comments. And I'd like to thank the Mayor for including the amendment to bullet point 4.1. And I was going to say something similar in terms of what it means to decarbonise our transport fleet. And walking and cycling is a tiny proportion of that overall. And just to back up what you were saying, with transport emissions being something like 43% of our emissions profile, we've actually got to shift in a huge number of ways right across our transport system. And a big part of that is going to be moving to electric vehicles and changing the way people travel around. So just wanted to emphasise that, because as councillors we have been given quite a lot of really good information that explains how we are going to have to look at decarbonising transport as part of the strategies and plans that we've already signed up to. So thank you for including that and elevating it. And also just overall for progressing the work on ATAP as such a significant project overall that really was so needed when it first came about to align government and Auckland Council, and it's really shown its worth. So it's good to see the work continuing. And also to support, so we added in the amendment with including the addition of the chair of IMSB, so I'm glad that that got brought forward. But again, I think it's already been mentioned that you know, we often make it really too hard to ensure that we have a diversity of views around the table, and I know there's lots of historic reasons for that, but do support the comments that have been made about always considering who's around the table, and so whenever we have the opportunity, I think we need to take it, because say particularly for women, the transport, how we interact with transport is different, and just having a diversity of views around the table always brings better outcomes. So overall, very supportive, and thank you for all the good work that's gone into this. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple of quick comments from me. Enjoyed the discussion. I'm glad to see that as part, you know, it's important that we continue to highlight the emerging themes or issues that have been outlined in the paper. Bullet point 2 refers to climate change and mode shift. And I have a particular interest in that because many people will know that out south there is huge reliance on cars. And so the more we can encourage our constituents out here to be given the opportunities or to have the opportunities to get out of cars, to move to active modes of transport, to get bus and train systems that are reliable. I think that's all part of the package here and inviting that movement away from being car dependent. So I think that's really good and welcome that continued overlay as part of the discussions that will be had. I just wanted to again highlight the discussion that's been had around diversity, supported the amendment. I think it's important that we have an Indigenous view around the table, and I think maybe perhaps when we approach the group about having an IMSB member at the table, that even the government might reflect on whether someone from their own team who is tangata whenua would be good to have around the table, because I think it's an ongoing discussion. We've got to change. We've got to make sure that all of the Indigenous views of New Zealand are heard, and that's important, that it not just be something that Council is advancing, but it's something that the government takes seriously too. And just finally, I think the points that have been made, especially by Councillors Fletcher, Desley, Simpson and Bartley around having female representation is an important aspect to understand as well. We've had ongoing discussions on diversity, ensuring that there's Indigenous perspective, that there's a gender balance or gender perspective, a gender aligned perspective that's involved in discussions. And I just want to reiterate my strength to that point, because I think it's a really important way forward. We've got to keep thinking about diversity at the table. We are Auckland, of course, a community, a city, a region with over 200 ethnicities, and so it's important that diversity remains highlighted in all of our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kathy Casey.
Well, hi, Phil. I've got a question for you and a question for Robert. Robert, my first question relates to the timing of this and the completion of phase 1 of the update by end of August. I see that's down here as a risk. When you say completed by the end of August by both parties, is that signed off, or is it just the work's completed and we'll sign it off when the new government's formed? So that's my question to you. My question, Phil, to you is, I'm looking at the Stuff article this morning that says the government's put light rail on hold. I didn't mind the headline so much as some of the words within the article. There are some doubts that light rail will ever get going again. My question to you is, who's responsible for combating that kind of headline within ATAP? Is it a government responsibility or is it your responsibility? And how do you secure, once it's signed off, if it is signed off, how do you secure or keep that tight during an election period? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. If I answer first and then David can answer the timing question. The decision was made in the Auckland Council. We have an interest in the way that it goes ahead, and we'll be involved in that decision making, and we'll make comment on it. But in terms of if it was part of the ATAP project and was being jointly funded by us, then that would be something that you'd expect comments from both sides on. But they made the decision, and I in fact welcomed the decision, that they would solely fund light rail, and that's why they have the primary responsibility for comments around that. I hope that helps. David, you've got you might like to address the first question about the timing.
Thank you, Councillor. Currently the time frame is trying to be delivered, finish it before September, but the government won't be able to sign that first phase of ATAP off before September due to elections. It's highlighted as a risk for just the simple thing that it's actually quite a difficult and time-consuming thing to do, and also the COVID-19 response and recovery work is taking away a lot of the party's staff. So I suppose it's just highlighted really that it's quite a difficult task, and we've got all sorts of other things that need to be done as well. So that's why I suppose it's a risk, but obviously we will do our best to deliver in the time that we are trying to do it to.
Councillor, you're probably aware that there is a constitutional convention that in the month, which will be the month of the election campaign, decisions, very significant decisions, aren't made in that context. So we'll have advice and we'll have discussion, and we may, hopefully we'll have agreement around what should be in it, but the government will need a mandate to come to the party, and that means that we would expect that early in the new term of the government. If there were a change of government, then there may be a desire to revise it, as there was at the last election, because the ATAP program looked quite differently after the change in government. So that's the reason for the timing. Okay, we come now to Councillor Josephine Bartley.
Thank you, Your Worship, and just to support the recommendations and to acknowledge the staff that have worked on this. and also the work that's happened previously to fund all these, projects, because there was that funding gap previously. Really good to see the climate change consideration in there, given the climate emergency we announced around this time last year, so that declaration isn't seen as being a token gesture. So it's really good to see that. But also, if we could still keep in mind the equity issues, we still have areas that have poor provision of transport, of public transport, and in order for the mode shift to happen that Councillor Collins talks about, we do need to make sure people have options to move to and that they're safe in doing that. I also want to acknowledge Councillor Fletcher's comments about diversity and gender in the transport space, because it is very obvious. Every time transport come and present to us, it's, students, you can just see that there is there's no women in that makeup. But anyway, agree with these, and thank you for the paper.
Thank you very much, Councillor. And just before I come to the last person, Councillor Watson, you said you'd wanted to make a very brief comment. I noticed in the sidebar.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Just very quickly, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points, and certainly agree with you. I think we maybe confine our $2.2 billion contribution to the CRL and not be looking to get involved in any light rail or any other big projects. That would be a useful starter at the moment. But I just wanted to try and put a little bit of perspective on things in terms of ATAP, and certainly in respect of the progress that has been made during the last couple of years. I mean, we are, as a council, we are light years ahead of where we were 3 years ago, and I think that has to be acknowledged. And as much as we might be thinking of making this demand or that demand on government, we're very much dependent on what the government decides to do for us, and it's foolish to think otherwise. And in that respect, I think it's very important to be cognizant of the comments made towards the end of our report about the danger of losing momentum here. That would be entirely counterproductive. This update's, it's not intended to be a wholesale review of the ATAP. We're told that, and the majority of the projects that are currently part of the program are either underway or there's a commitment to the delivery. So I'm assuming, and indeed this is what's said in the report, that those package of projects, and I note that phrase in particular, they're looking to continue the uninterrupted delivery of that program, and that's critical. To start going back with any significant changes to that would in some ways would undercut the public endorsement that included the regional fuel tax, for instance. So I'm assuming that's a safe assumption to make, notwithstanding the obvious fact that there will be some changes required as a consequence of COVID-19. But I think it's important, Mr. Mayor, to realise that Council has been the beneficiary, and certainly in the current climate, we need to continue to be the beneficiary because we know how constrained we are. So to suggest otherwise, I think is a little hopeful, to say the least. So I acknowledge the role that the Deputy Mayor had played in that discussion for some time, but I just urge the various members that are now apparently part of the governance group that we maintain that momentum, because as much as there's been a lot of hopeful budgets and allocation, the delivery of projects is about to kick off in some instances. So, we're not actually seeing the fruits of that on the ground. That's tantalisingly close. So, the last thing we want to do is really undercut the momentum that's already been achieved over a number of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Watson, and I just want to pick up your comment about the role of the Deputy Mayor, because Bill Cashmore has put an incredible amount of work into this, way back to the beginning, I think, of the ATAP project, Bill. So I'll leave the last comments to you, and thank you for your efforts in the progress we've made.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, councillors, for all your inputs on this. Now, ATAP has been an important part of the growth of Auckland, and it is a live document. It's not cast in stone or granite. It will iterate and change and move as we have seen today, and that's all welcomed. ATAP, the key most important word in it is alignment. When we started, the government through Ministry of Transport and the council were probably two different paths, and you've heard me say before, paralysis by analysis, and we were going round and round in circles arguing around pointless issues. And it wasn't until we actually got some agreement about pathways forwards and what were going to be the critical criteria we measure, population growth, population densities, people on public transport. That's the critical point. ATAP is based upon data, and so it should be, and data that's agreed by the parties involved. So that's been the movement forward, and it will change. There will be an increasing focus on clean fuels and methods of promotion. There will be movements on greater PT, and who knows what's going to be further into the future. So it's good that it changes and it iterates, and it's good that it moves, and it's good that it's been revised again now. What we're seeing with 100% funding of the current agreement, and I emphasise the current agreement is in play and is actually been actioned on, and will be until this new one is put in place. What has been agreed is the fully funding mechanism of it now demonstrates the greater degree of understanding and parity between the council and the government and the staff who are driving it. Now, I'd like to recognise Stephen Town and his governance team around that, who's actually driven a lot of the nuts and bolts work for it to actually get ATAP delivering a fully funded program, which is in reality now a thick end of 30 billion. So thank you very much, everybody. Good work.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Now, the sense I've got is that this may be approved unanimously, in which case I wouldn't call a division. But if there is anybody that wants me to call a division, I will do. Otherwise, I'll do it on voices on the basis that I think there is probably unanimous approval for it. Is there any call for a division? If not, I'll put it on the votes. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Thank you.
Aye.
Is there anybody against? Okay, I declare that passed unanimously, and like to thank Robert and Zening and David and all of those involved in putting this paper together. And to reiterate what others have said, ATAP is a huge advance on what we had in the past, and it's vital to our success in tackling the challenges that we have in our transport system. We come now to item number 10, which is board appointments, and this is a process only report. So maybe I'll ask Chris Fletcher as the Vice Chair of the Appointments Committee, and maybe Josephine Bartley just to move and second this, and if there's no questions or comments, we'll deal with the substantive issues in the confidential section. So can I have those two people as mover and seconder?
I'm happy to move.
Okay, are there any questions or comments? If not, I'll put the resolution. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Aye. The contrary, no. I declare that carried. We come now for the procedural motion to, and I will move that we exclude the public from the next two items on the agenda, the reappointment of directors to the Tamaki Redevelopment Company and the emergency budget update. Do I have, and that's because of reasons of confidentiality around appointments as normal, and the budget update for reasons that we discussed yesterday in workshop needs to be confidential until such time as we're ready to put the document out for consultation. Do I have a seconder for that motion, please?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I declared that carried. Now, we are required to come in for the confidential Skype meeting, so I suggest we just take a break of 5 minutes, and then we'll get back in and deal with the last two items on our agenda. Thank you.